for coming to this session. I heard you had a very good morning session and lunch speaker, so we hope to keep this after lunch session as exciting to keep you all engaged. So this is a panel discussion, and we're really going to be talking about how technology, specifically mobile and social media, and what kind of impact it's had on the rule of law. So if we could maybe have my slides put up here. Okay, this is an older version, but that's fine. We'll go with this. So the official title is Innovations in Engagement, How Do Social Media and Mobile Apps Impact the Rule of Law? So I'm Rohini Srihari, and I'm the Chief Data Scientist here at Peace-Tech Lab. And for those of you who are wondering what Peace-Tech Lab is, we are actually right here within the USIP, and our group focuses on data, technology, and media for peace building. So I direct all the data programs, and we're working on a very interesting platform. Maybe I'll briefly speak about it. But if we could just go to the next slide for a second. Pardon? Oh, okay. All right, which one is it? This one here? Okay, great. We'll try again. Is this big green button here? Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. All right. So what I thought I'd do is just sort of briefly introduce the topic and give you some examples which are really interesting, I thought, in terms of what has been already accomplished. But most of it is going to be a discussion with some great panelists, some of them who I just met for the first time today, and I'll introduce them to you in a few minutes. So the way we're going to run the panel is I'll give a brief intro, no more than 10 minutes on the topic, mostly some examples. And then we're going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves and give some opening remarks. And that will be about 30 minutes. And then after that, we're going to have a discussion session where I get to ask questions and they will respond. And then after that, the audience has an opportunity to also ask questions. And so I think there's plenty of time for discussion. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So with that, we'll get started. So if we could have the next slide. I just wanted to give some examples of different kinds of technology that's been used in this area of rule of law. Press this one right, really hard. Okay, I think I'm going to have to start with the Me Too movement. It's been incredible how fast and how rapidly this has taken hold of our society. I think in a period of 2 weeks, there were something like 3 million references to this on Twitter, and other social media was really what caused this to really explode. And in the media and discussions, we only hear about the celebrities and the big cases. But I think many would agree that the real impact of this is not on the celebrities, but other people, other women, who don't, who really have now feel empowered to come forward and express what they've been experiencing. So we decided to showcase this as an example of really social media and how it's making an impact in terms of justice. So some other examples. Okay, there we go. Hate speech. There's been a lot of work on hate speech, and this is Mandola as an effort by the European Union, where people can report on hate speech And hate speech we've shown at Peace-Tech. In fact, we've been working on hate speech quite a bit also in different areas. Mandola is focused mostly on the European Union. Our work has focused on South Sudan, Kenya, South Africa, primarily the African continent. And the important thing really is that we've shown actually that a rise in hate speech can be directly correlated with incidents of violence in some of these countries also. So this is an important type of initiative, and I know that Facebook is also doing quite a bit in this area. Just moving forward, this is one of the earlier efforts that many people were probably familiar with, I Paid a Bribe in India. Where citizens can actually report and they provide analytics and so on. It's a good initiative, but in the discussion session, I think we're going to come back to some of these sites and really talk about, have these really been effective? Have they made an impact? Do people feel empowered to report? Are they worried about reporting these kinds of things? So there are a lot of issues here, but nevertheless, it's a great example of social media being used to report, in this case, corruption. And unfortunately, the corruption seems to continue despite these efforts. Hafez, this was a mobile app that emerged during the 2018 Iranian protests, and a very popular site, so people can send news about human rights violations, but the mobile app also provides really useful information to people in terms of where to go for help if they're arrested or if they are persecuted, names of attorneys, things like that, something that has really caught on, this particular one, fairly recent one. iRespond, this is digital identity, all about how people, including people in refugee camps, can be provided digital identities, and through technologies like blockchain and so on, which would then enable them to get help and the kind of assistance that they need. Just in case anyone's going to be here tomorrow, there's a major conference tomorrow being held at USIP, blockchain and social impact. So if anyone's here and would like to attend, I think that's also kind of interesting. This one I'm not going to talk much about because we're very fortunate to have the founder and CEO of this platform right here with us today, who will talk more about this. ICMEC, so this I wanted to highlight because this is a organization, a company actually, that we run an incubator here called the Peace-Tech Accelerator, which is an incubator for companies, both nonprofits and for-profits, who are doing something in terms of making a social impact globally. And it's actually, for those of you who've been in this building, it's in the basement of this building, which we affectionately call the Bat Cave. It's really pretty cool space, actually. And about 4 times a year, we have cohorts of companies, 7, 8 companies from all over the world, who come and spend 8 weeks here. And they are mentored in terms of business, technology, marketing, financing, all of that. This was one of the companies that went through the accelerator called ICMEC, but basically they work on, it's a center for missing and exploited children. And when they came here, one of the things that we were able to do was introduce them to folks at Amazon Web Services, who have technology for identifying faces in crowds. And people have seen maybe not so good uses of this, but in this case, they're able to pick out children in these photographs and match them against reporting. And we had a really success case a few weeks ago when someone actually came forward and said, I believe that I was kidnapped 17 years ago or something. So it was amazing. So this is, I think, a really nice example of technology being used for good. So I think with that, I'm going to sort of stop talking. There's a lot of challenges. Some of them I've sort of briefly mentioned in terms of the data. There's issues of how you collect the data, privacy of data, regulations, and most of all, impact of all of these types of solutions. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, who's Jeffrey Aresti, and he's the president of internetbar.org, right?
Thank you.
So Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you. And I'll just look for the slides. Do we have the video queued up by any chance? There's a video, a link that we wanted to run. This is the work that we do, and we go to a place like Timor-Leste, and this is the work of an international human rights lawyer, David Levy, who was able to document the transition of Meli Fernandez from a child fighter who was in the hills. There was no respect for the rule of law. There was no respect for the government. Timor-Leste, there was no effective rule of law, and yet through music, we were able to at least start the process of creating trust and identity and give a group of people the chance to put down their arms and build a culture of respect for the rule of law, which in a place where there is no law is the first step that you have to take in getting started. Meli has turned it not only into an artist, but also an incubator of change for social justice in his own community. But just a little bit of background about myself. I'm an international business lawyer for 40 years. That means that I go back to the time when the PC first came out, the TRS-80 first came out, the first Mac came out, and I had all of them from the very beginning. I also, at that time, saw the first killer app. I was working in an accounting firm. The PC-1 came out, along with an electronic spreadsheet called VisiCalc. And literally hundreds of computers arrived at Coopers and Lybrand within the course of 3 or 4 months, with auditors running around the offices, giving each other high fives, saying, "You just press the recalc button." And that would save them hours and hours of painstaking pencil-like work. So I was very interested and got active. I was in Massachusetts as a lawyer for all these years and growing up in that environment, and I was one of the founders of the American Bar Association's Tech Show. So I can speak confidently by saying that in the years I've practiced, there has not been a killer app for the legal profession. In fact, law is the reason why technology can't innovate. Law basically stops innovation because of the jurisdictional nature of what is going on. And so when you start thinking about it, you ask yourself the question, well, if several times this morning we hear that technology is so fast and law can't keep up, and yet we keep throwing technology at it, aren't we missing half the equation? Probably the most important half. How we make laws and how we enforce laws is what needs to change. And that's pretty much what I would like to talk to you about. My background as a lawyer, though, began representing my dad in the shoe business. So back in the 70s and 80s, he traveled all over the world, and with letters of credit and telexes, he basically was doing e-commerce. We just now have e-commerce democratized in that kind of a setting. But all that same type of technology has been available for years, and we've been able to do it. There's a professor of law at USC, Gillian Hadfield, who wrote a book called Rules of Law for a Flat World. And what she essentially said in that kind of environment is that in order for there to be a new way to make laws, we need to rely much more heavily on the private sector. And mobile phones gives us that ability. Well, I'm going to just click through to get all the points up on the slide, if we can. Mobile phones essentially are in the position of connecting all of us with each other around the world. This sense of hyper-connectedness that exists in the world has spawned revolutions. So if there's any question about the potential for making rules of law change with this hyper-connectedness, you just have to take a look at the revolutions. Now, they created voids, and in the absence of law in those settings, unintended consequences could occur. So there needs to be some thoughtful process as we work forward. Now, I work with mostly millennials in a small organization. You'll see a couple pictures of the people that I work with a little bit later. Essentially, millennials want to radically collaborate with each other. They do not want to have silos that bind them in any way to each other. They want to just connect regardless, aim at a particular solution, and then make it happen in real time, regardless of the platform that they're using. And so when law becomes an issue in that kind of setting, it's because of the paradox of reform. Most of the conversation about reform at the institutional level, when you're talking about government and reforming law, only affects a handful of people, the enfranchised. The disenfranchised can only reference societal norms, and then they have to make change from the bottom up. If we want to engage people like Melly in the context of making changes in laws, we have to give them that kind of access from the bottom up. Now, you've heard, of course, all about the top-down efforts which exist at the international diplomacy level, at the public international law level. But if you think about bottom-up efforts from the ground up, the most important things that I will have are at the bottom of this slide, which are mobile phones, self-sovereign identity, blockchain, smart contracts, and digital wallets. Now, in a radically collaborative environment, we have companies that are ready to work on all of these areas right from the beginning, and all we have to do is put a deal and put them all together. So let me give you the names of companies that you'll see that we're already partnering with to get this job done. The World Justice Project was actually the first seed funder of the Internet Bar and giving us the opportunity to focus in on how arts and culture could become a foundation for reaching normative behavior in a society, and to use music as a platform to express that. So that even though music is not the place where you typically think of as a lawmaking society, it happens to be universal language. And of course, if you grew up in the 60s, you know that music was really the foundation of a major major revolution of thinking in this country. So societal norms will certainly start in that kind of a setting. But now if you're in a place like Timor-Leste or any other of the developing countries that we're in, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, you're going to places where there are people that have no identities. Half the world, 3.5 billion people, do not have any kind of an identity. So as we talk about digital identities and all the problems that you're facing with digital identities, the choice to make of working in the developing world where the justice system is not an obstacle to change is not only is a smarter choice just from a legal development standpoint, but it's a smarter choice just because it's the right choice to make from a social justice standpoint. And so we work in those kinds of environments. Self-sovereign identity, which is a global public utility that's been created by a group out of Utah called Sovereign in the global public utility setting. There are other groups that have also adopted the self-sovereign identity model, is a model which essentially reverses the whole concept of identity from the ownership that we've all given up when we clicked I accept to every terms of service for every social media platform and every email service and every place that we've gone. We're starting with self-sovereign identity in the context of we each have to make our own claim about ourselves. Think about it in the context of the Syrian nurse who's worked for 25 years, now finds herself in Lesbos, and the public international legal framework for refugees and the national laws do not give her a chance to ever be a nurse again. Not only is that a travesty for her personally, it's a travesty for the world as a whole because she has a lot of skills, and they should not be stopped because of the ravages of war. Yet, how can she, in an environment of a refugee camp, establish her identity? The self-sovereign identity approach has the notion of making verifiable claims. The term verifiable is a term that every lawyer should grab onto. If you want to see where the future of the practice of law is going to be, that term verifiable is where you're going to find it. Because as she stands there next to somebody who has to receive information before it gets put up into this immutable blockchain that's not going to change ever, how do you know that she's telling the truth, that she worked in this hospital doing this kind of work for the past 25 years? She's going to bring some people around her. She's going to give herself some indications of support, of people that can verify what she did. But that's only going to be a starting point. And then maybe if the camp self-organizes in some way, she'll be able to get a chance to work, and maybe a doctor from the developed world, Doctors Beyond Borders, comes down and in a LinkedIn kind of environment starts giving her check marks for work that she's doing. And little by little, she might be able to build up attributes of identity which she herself controls. Because the way the blockchain works, nobody else will have access to any of those attributes except for her. So self-sovereign identity is an aspect of it, and Sovereign.org has made that open source platform available to all of us. Internet Bar, the organization that I founded with several others in 2005, we are the folks working on the identity for all best practices concept. So best practices, of course, would be focusing in on that nurse. How do we establish identity and verifiable claims in that context? How do those best practices apply in different environments that might be other types of camps, orphanages, other countries around the world? Eventually, they have to make their way to some international standard, and we're talking to the international standards groups from the very beginning to make sure that that works. Now, if you have an identity, you then also want to have an ability to use that identity. And if you have to demonstrate it, we've partnered with a group called odem.io, which is an incredible group that has already built out ways to take these claims that people make about themselves and turn them into certifications. So those certifications could exist in lieu of diplomas or other forms of certifications. And then once you meet certain tests and standards, that can also go up on the blockchain. They've partnered with us so that as we go from camp to camp or orphanage or different country environment, there are going to be different paths to identity certification that we're going to have to take before something goes up on the blockchain. Another group that we work with is VIPO. Now, this is interesting because if you have an identity, what are you going to do with it? that fellow Melly Fernandez is singing. Isn't there some digital asset that's being created there, some intellectual property that's being developed? Of course there is, and we want to be able to make sure that Melly Fernandez can benefit from that intellectual property. Well, years ago, there was coming out of Harvard Law School, there was a group called Second Life, and they started building up this whole notion of, let's see if we can take law and play with it in a virtual environment. And a lot of people played there. And law firms were built inside of Second Life, and a lot of people ended up with skills. And of course, the gamers, as you know, are very successful in these online environments, and it's real money transfers back and forth at very high rates. And guess what? Intellectual property disputes started to arise. The woman who ran one of the law firms inside of Second Life is now running our music project. She's brought all types of contracts, enforcement mechanisms that she's built in the Second Life environment over with us, and now we're partnering with a group called the Accord Project and with the Integra Ledger to take those, what we call fair trade music models, which you'll hear more about in a few seconds, and put them into the blockchain in the form of smart contracts. Well, let me just get through. So the P-Stones process, which I'll just tell you very briefly, essentially has us going into those communities and identifying the local musicians and giving them the opportunity to take their music and put it up online. The most important part of this particular process is the ability to give people there the opportunity to get out of their own way. The current problem that we're working with is in the Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where 700,000 Rohingya Muslims have been transferred from Myanmar into Bangladesh, and we're giving technology tools so that they can use virtual currency to incentivize each of them to be able to govern the camp itself, as they may not be in a position yet to develop some intellectual property, though we're working with some to do that there. So the fair trade music model, these are the kids in the Bangladesh camp that we're singing, allows them to benefit from the social justice fair trade music platform, and then through innovation, they will be able to gain their own identity. How can you all get involved in this? We decided hyperconnectedness means that each one of us needs to reach out to you. The idea that you're raising public awareness in this environment of the problem there is not enough. Each one of you can be a digital pen pal to some individual in those settings and work together. Every one of us is going to need an identity, and we can learn from each other. So part of what Internet Bar is doing is establishing this kind of a program so that we can develop that there. And as you can see, radical collaboration gives us the opportunity to bring a lot of people together all at once to do this. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So we'll move on to Karen.
I think they just have to, oops. No. I'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us together. I work at Physicians for Human Rights, and maybe just by way of background, until the slides come up, Physicians for Human Rights is an international NGO. We use science and medicine to document human rights violations around the world. And, and we have used the evidence that we've collected in various investigations to help support accountability mechanisms in many, many cases around the world. We were established more than 30 years ago, and over the course of doing this work, we very quickly identified that sexual violence cases were some of the hardest cases to prosecute. As many of you know, it's very, very difficult for survivors to even dare to come forward, certainly in the context of conflict or a fragile environment or even post-conflict context. The stigma is so great from their families, from the community, and there's incredible risk of reprisal, among many, many other hardships. But what we identified is that there are still cases of survivors who are willing to take those risks and have their day in court. And this photo that you're seeing is 14 survivors who wanted their day in court in DRC to face the accused. What is so devastating about so many of these cases is that they fail because there's a lack of adequate evidence to support the allegations of the survivors. So many of these cases fail because there are numerous obstacles to adequately gathering evidence to support these prosecutions. Forensic medical exams are rarely conducted in many of these environments. People are not adequately trained. Medical charts fail to document meaningful findings that could help inform investigations and prosecutions. There are very few, if any, storage facilities at a medical facility or at a police station or even in court. There's a lack of clarification of roles across the medical, law enforcement, and legal communities about what each of these professionals' roles are within the course of a justice process. And there's an absence of a shared language, as you all know, even from our work in this country and in your work in other countries as well. The medical community has their own professional jargon. The law enforcement community and legal community have their own professional jargon. And none of these communities can truly understand their counterparts from other sectors. So all of this goes to the notion that there is a need, a serious gap in coordination across all these sectors to work on sexual violence cases. So in 2011, we established the Program on Sexual Violence in Conflict Zones at Physicians for Human Rights. The goal of the program is to help improve the process for the police and clinicians, doctors, nurses, lawyers, judges, to be able to more effectively collect and document and preserve forensic evidence of sexual violence to help support local prosecutions of these crimes. And also, the critical component of this work is to be able to cultivate networks of collaboration among these professionals so that they could work together with each other more effectively on a case-by-case basis to better support the survivor at the center of this process. We do this work in Kenya and in DRC, and we've started to also pilot this program in Central African Republic. I'm going to share with you some updates about our interventions on the low-tech side and on the high-tech side and how this is played out in court. So we run very robust training workshops on low-tech capacities that clinicians and police and lawyers and judges can do within their communities with the resources that they have. So how to ask better questions during a patient encounter, how to do a full head-to-toe exam, for example, in order to do a proper forensic medical evaluation. We also train on how to do pediatric evaluations. Pediatric cases are very common in these communities. We train on crime scene investigations, how to document a crime scene, how to collect evidence and package it and maintain chain of custody. We also focus a lot on documentation. Documentation is critical. And when we started to do our work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we saw that there was no standardized medical intake form to document sexual violence cases. So we worked together very closely with our colleagues from the medical, law enforcement, and legal communities to create a standard form to document sexual violence cases, a forensic form. And we borrowed from Kenya and from South Africa, the United States, Canada, many other places that had a forensic medical form. And our Congolese partners identified those aspects of the form that would be most useful to their context. And they developed this medical certificate. This medical certificate is now being used in the eastern part of Congo in military and civilian courts, and it has had a transformative effect on cases going to court. Cases are succeeding more and more because there's more data that the clinicians are prompted to ask by virtue of having this form. So it's a low-tech solution, but it is transforming these cases. And the judges are the most thrilled to have this form because it helps them adjudicate these cases by virtue of having more data to help them in their decision making. Nevertheless, we are functioning in environments where there are external factors that still make it very difficult to pursue these cases effectively. So if a health facility is several kilometers outside in a remote area of the country, it can be very difficult for the police to actually navigate roads like this in DRC and elsewhere where this is a common site because they don't have, for example, access to vehicles or even money for fuel to get to the health facility to be able to pick up this medical certificate. So there are a range of infrastructure challenges that we have encountered that also present as an obstacle to justice. So we started to identify that in places of low-income countries, middle-income countries, certainly where we work in East and Central Africa, there's incredible mobile penetration in these communities. And so we've developed Medicapt. It's a mobile app that pairs a standard medical intake form with photo capture capacity to allow the clinicians to actually document their findings on a digital platform and to be able, this is what a screenshot of what it looks like. So they're able to document their findings and identify which parts of the body the injuries were sustained. And it prompts clinicians to take forensic photographs during the patient encounter. The app can work without Wi-Fi connectivity. The clinicians could use this and create as many records as needed. Eventually, to upload it to the cloud, they do need Wi-Fi connectivity to be able to upload it to the cloud. But one of the big innovations that we have developed through working on this tool is how to also, in a paper-full environment, how to be able to provide a copy of the form to the survivor at the center of this process. And so we had to develop a mechanism to allow the clinicians to be able to print directly from their tablet or phone to a printer without any electricity, without routing the data, the confidential data, through the internet, to be able to allow the survivor to take a copy of her own certificate home with her. And then the police and justice sector officials would be able to access the data from the cloud. And it's been very challenging to determine who should have access to what data because the workflows are very different in very different communities. But the idea is that the data that's gathered in the medical facility can directly inform the police investigations and prosecutions. We have developed the tool, the app, using collaborative design or co-design. That's the ethos of working with the end users as we design and develop this tool. So we are constantly working with our partners in DRC and Kenya, field testing the app, getting their feedback, what's working, what's not working for you, what do you need by way of necessity, priority for this tool to be valuable for you at the end of the day when this product is completed. And so this has been an incredibly helpful tool for us to learn about their needs, but even more effectively for them to feel like they're invested in this process too. In this tool, they can directly see their feedback and input into the final product. We're hoping to build out this tool to be able to allow us to do aggregation of de-identified data so that we can do crime mapping to be able to use the data to identify, for example, perpetrator troop movement or what uniforms the perpetrators may have worn, languages spoken, or the injuries sustained by the survivors. All of these items are really critical for tracking trends or patterns mechanisms in the violence that are critical to helping to support allegations of crimes against humanity, for example, where we need to identify evidence that can support widespread or systematic crimes taking place. It's also really critical to show that who may be in charge as command responsibility for these cases. I just want to end by identifying how this has played itself out in court. In Kavumu, a small village in DRC, we started to see cases of young girls, some as young as 18 months old to 11 years old, being targeted in really brutal cases of sexual violence. They were taken from their homes in the middle of their night and brought to a field and brutally violated and abandoned there. Eventually, they were taken to a nearby hospital, Panzi Hospital, where they were treated, and the clinicians who we had been working with documented every single one of these cases using this medical certificate. Over the course of 3 years, 42 cases of these young girls came to the hospital. And they didn't happen all at once, but they happened systematically, and all of the girls had the same mode of experience of the violation and brutal, brutal injuries. It became very difficult for this case to be investigated because it surfaced that a very powerful militia group was responsible for these crimes. And the leader of this militia group is a sitting member of provincial parliament in South Kivu. So it took years, but with advocacy, with the community, with the medical and legal professionals, we worked to have his immunity stripped, and finally it was. And he, along with 17 other members of the militia group, stood before court last November. Evidence was collected and beautifully labeled, and it convinced, and victims and witnesses underwent very strategic, innovative protections. But ultimately, in December of 2017, 11 men, including this lawmaker, were convicted of crimes against humanity for rape and murder. Ultimately, we see that small steps can actually have a big impact. And so it's been very heartening to see how medical and legal communities, by virtue of working together, can help to secure a greater likelihood of success in prosecutions, but really significantly help to bring meaningful access to justice, respect, and security to survivors and the communities affected by these crimes.
Thanks. That was quite compelling. So next we have Antoine.
Thank you, Ronnie. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to share our experience. Sometimes I get asked why what's the name? The Ulula refers to the ululation that women make in East Africa, Northern Africa, and other cultures for funerals or weddings, because the idea behind Ulula when I started it 5 years ago was, how can we give a voice to people that are typically invisible or completely silenced in supply chains or deep in emerging markets. That came from working 10 years in these countries and thinking that I was the white men preaching things that were never going to happen. And I saw technology as a means to an end, not as an end in itself. I'm an economist, so I have my own problems, but I didn't drink the Kool-Aid of technology, if you will. So I started Ulula about the time that the Rana Plaza happened, which is something that is typically vivid in your memory, where 1,100 Bangladeshi workers died in the collapse of the Rana Plaza complex. Yep. And the idea that we had, was broader than that. Actually, we started with ideas around raw materials, which I knew best, and we have quite a bit of experience in, with the idea that we would use very simple mobile phones, so very similar to you, that you needed to go super low tech first to provide a way for workers and communities to have a voice in the way they were treated at work or the impacts that other big companies may have on them. So we created this mechanism that can do that in a way that I'm going to describe. the background to that is you know, I think Ambassador De Baca gave a fairly extensive, you know, overview of the problems that he has spearheaded, but the backdrop is, you know, 40 million people are victims of modern slavery. A lot of them are women, and so have real problems in getting their voices heard, and that's ubiquitous. I mean, if you ask you know, a company whether there is modern slavery in their supply chain, if they say no, it's probably that they haven't been looking. And that doesn't mean they are really bad. That means it's a very complex issue. So, but it's a pervasive problem that touches many goods and you know, happens in the US, happens in Bangladesh, happens everywhere. So it's not something that one can feel safe about. It's really a pervasive problem that we're trying to tackle. And I think from the perspective of this symposium, on the one hand, I think we've seen a lot of progress in terms of, you know, legal regimes, especially I would say in OECD countries with the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. Now there is a new regime coming up in Australia. There is a new law in France. So you see this burgeoning of you know, legal reforms that are very helpful in many ways, because they are, I think, making the cost of modern slavery higher and changing the incentives. But on the other hand, I think enforcement is broken, and I think that's where technology has a role to play. Self-enforcement through audits is something that is very limited for a range of reasons. I mean, the ways in which audits are conducted is flawed. It's, you know, with a bunch of workers that are supposedly anonymous, but not quite so, for a range of reasons. It's at best a picture in time, and that doesn't give you a sense of the changing circumstances, and the way these are conducted is always, typically announced. So that's not conducive to a very good sense of what is actually going on in a factory, in a plant, etc. And so that's the backdrop of ULULA, and on the other hand, you have governments that are, you know, in an ideal world would play a role, but typically you're talking about places, you know, similar to what you were describing, that are where the rule of law is poor and difficult to enforce. So what is ULULA in all that? I mean, the solution has three core modules, and that are here. It's really the low tech and that I'm presenting. We can run surveys in about over 130 countries using SMS, voice, social media, and the web. So we're trying to be omni-channel. We're not trying to say, you know, there is one that is superior to the other. The one thing that we're not is an app. The reasons for that is that you have still 50% of the world that is offline. And you have, you know, app retention, apart from, you know, friends on this panel, having a big problem in keeping people on their app. So we felt that, you know, staying simple, staying native was the way to go, and really trying to develop two-way conversations. So surveys is obviously one way. That's very simple, but having grievance management has been something that we started working on, so that we can raise cases, understand when there is gender violence or harassment or other types of abuses of human rights or labor rights. And just broadcasting, you know, in terms of awareness is the third leg of that stool that we have. Now, all of that is super low tech, but we can do that at scale in over 100 countries, and that's powered as well with a partnership that we have with IBM to use Watson in terms of data analytics. And now we're getting into the blockchain world, which I can talk about, but I think it's baby steps at the moment, where we are seeing, you know, how can we provide more credibility to the human side of, you know, what's provided on a blockchain when you're encoding the provenance of the goods. So I'll finish with three examples quickly. One is, you know, we've been working with quite a few corporations, and here it's just an example in China, where there is definitely government capacity to enforce, but actually 80% of the audits in China are false for one reason or the other. There is corruption, there's a number of reasons why the information that you get is not quite right. So that working with these corporations, we've been working to crowdsource information directly from workers and to understand what were the problems. what we've seen in terms of, we've done that through voice, and so that limits eavesdropping. We were not using WeChat in that sense because there are also some problems with WeChat in China. We can use it in other settings, but this one was required, I think, voice. And we found out issues with wages, with health and safety that didn't pop up in any audit report before. That led to some actions in terms of health and safety training, in terms of changing in management practices, and some considerations on wages. I mean, that are, I think, much more complex to tackle. Another example that expands, I think, the scope of what we have, but looking at human rights more broadly is, we're working with extractive companies in various countries to basically get the pulse of their social environmental impact so that they don't get in trouble, because they typically do, because they really don't understand what their impact is. And so we've been working in South Africa, Chile, Peru, and Brazil to basically get a continuous pulse surveys of what is the impact of a mine on health, education, safety, dust, etc. A range of indicators using SMS and voice again, and feeding that data back and flagging when there are issues to the company with fairly strong participation rates, because we use small airtime incentives that do work in this context. And you're talking about rural Peru, things that are super last mile deployment. A third example, before I stop, is taking a different perspective. I mean, it's what we do is not is really working when you have multiple parties coming up. I mean, I'm going very fast on these examples, but very often, we are just a technology. We are not responding to cases because nobody should trust me per se. I mean, I don't have 10 years of experience working in Peru or in China, etc. You need to have people that are who a worker can trust. They speak the language. They know that these guys have stuck their neck out for me, and I'm just there to provide a mechanism for them to do their work more effectively and at scale. And in that case, I think the impetus came from the government, so with collaboration from companies and other NGOs to tackle problems around, again, issues with not just mining, but mining telecommunications infrastructure that the government was unable to, and still has struggles to enforce when it comes to the social impact, the consultation with communities, and where our system is able to provide information to citizens, register their grievance, and then connect with the companies about the problems that are facing when you have environmental impact assessments. So these are, I think, these are a few examples that I wanted to share, and I'm happy to discuss more. Thanks.
Thanks, Antoine. And Zaid?
Great, thanks. I don't have any slides, so it'll just be me. Thanks for inviting me, Hamid. I work on strategic response at Facebook. We are a small team within product policy. Our product policy team is the team that's responsible for writing our content policies of what we allow and don't allow on Facebook. And I work on a small team that works cross-functionally across a bunch of different organizations at the company, including legal and operations, cybersecurity, our counterterrorism team, et cetera, to deal with any number of content-related crises that we have at the company. So I briefly want to talk about a few things. First, our community standards, then misinformation and false news, our work around elections, and then some important changes that we've made at Facebook recently. So our community standards, we recently published our detailed community standards that our reviewers use to make decisions about what is and isn't allowed on our platform. And we put these detailed standards out for 3 reasons. First, we wanted to be absolutely clear that harmful language, images, and videos have no place on Facebook. And then second, we believe that increased transparency will provide more clarity on where we draw lines on complex and evolving issues. And then finally, we hope that by sharing the details, this will prompt more open discussion and honest dialogue about our decision-making process. Our community standards are global. That means what applies here applies in every other country around the world. Some people in Brazil don't like that because it means they can't post things that other people might find objectionable. in other places, and people in Saudi Arabia don't necessarily like that because there are things that people post that we allow that they wouldn't necessarily allow. Our content reviewers undergo extensive training after they join, and also after they've been at the company for a few months. They are regularly trained and are trained when our policies are clarified, and also when they evolve, because our policies change all the time. Our nudity policy, for example, has changed throughout our history. We make mistakes all the time, and when we are made aware of those mistakes, then we change our decision, and we also make sure to retrain the person who made the mistake to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So next I'll talk about misinformation and false news. I think it's important to note that we at Facebook, we don't arbitrate the truth. We've talked to a lot of experts, and they agree with us that they don't think that Facebook should be in the business of deciding what's right and what's wrong. That said, over the last couple of years, we've been working really hard to reduce the spread of false news on Facebook through a combination of machine technology and also human review. With misinformation, we have to fight bad actors, bad behavior, and also bad content. So by bad actors, I mean fake accounts, foreign agents, spammers, scammers, hackers, and repeat offenders. By bad behavior, I'm talking about polarizing, misleading, spamming, impersonation, sensationalizing, or engagement bait. And by bad content, I'm talking about false news, hate speech, spam, graphic violence, clickbait, and links to low-quality web experiences, which we refer to as ad farms. To better communicate our approach to misinformation, we actually commissioned a short film. It's about 12 minutes. It's on our website called Facing Facts, and it's an inside look at Facebook's fight against misinformation and how we are marshaling the forces against it. Misinformation is nuanced and really a complicated and complex problem, and we're combating it from multiple different angles. We released recently an updated news literacy campaign that provides people with tips on how to spot false news and also how to report it. We're also measuring our progress in our fight against misinformation, but we feel that it's critically important to do this. So in April, we announced a new initiative to help provide independent research about the role of social media in elections and also its effect on democracy more generally. I'll talk a little bit about Facebook's strategy for stopping false news. So at Facebook, we identify false news as news articles that purport to be factual, but which contain intentional misstatements of fact with the intention to arouse passions, attract viewership, or deceive. And false news has been a tool for economic or political gains, and we're seeing new ways of it taking shape online. Spammers can use it to try to drive clickbait or to yield profits, and it's been used by adversaries in recent elections as well. False news is bad for people, and it's bad for Facebook. But we're making significant investments to stop it from spreading and to promote high-quality journalism and news literacy. Our strategy to stop misinformation on Facebook has 3 parts: remove, reduce, and inform. So we remove accounts and content that violate our community standards or our ad policies. We reduce the distribution of false news and inauthentic content like clickbait. And then we inform people by giving them more context around posts that they see. This approach roots out bad actors and that frequently spread false news. It dramatically decreases the reach of the false news, and it helps people to stay informed without stifling public discourse. Another tool that we have to reduce the spread of false news is that we've been engaging third-party fact checkers all around the world to let people know when they are sharing news stories, excluding satire and opinion, that have been disputed or debunked, and to limit the distribution of those stories that have been flagged as misleading, sensational, or spammy. We demote articles found to be false by fact checkers in the newsfeed, causing them to lose about 80% of their traffic. We now work with independent fact checkers in the United States, France, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, Italy, Mexico, Colombia, India, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and we're also continuing to roll out new fact checkers around the world. Next, I'm going to talk about elections and our goals for elections at Facebook. We want to help people. We're tackling a wide range of election integrity issues on our platform to ensure that people have accurate information about elections, they feel safe expressing their opinions, and that they are motivated to participate in the electoral process. We also want to make elections better by preventing foreign interference, which remains our top priority. We must also tackle a wider range of election integrity problems proactively, like false amplification. We also want to improve election discourse on the platform. We take action on fake accounts, disrupt economic incentives, and prioritize informative posts and downrank inauthentic content, including false news and misinformation in newsfeed. We also want to build useful tools. So our civic engagement product priorities focus on various times people can use Facebook or might use Facebook in an election cycle. For example, telling somebody when they can register to vote, or reminding somebody that election day is coming up. We want to find ways to do more as well. So we're investing heavily in people, boosting technology, proactively looking for harmful content, bringing more transparency to all of our ads, including political ads, and working with the broader community. And then we're tracking over 40 elections around the world. I'm part of one of the teams that does that. In recent months, we started to deploy new tools and teams to proactively identify threats to the run-up to specific elections. The latest was the referendum in Ireland, the abortion referendum in Ireland. We first tested an effort during the Alabama Senate election and plan to continue these efforts for elections around the globe, including the US midterm elections. Last year, we used public service announcements to help inform people about false news in 21 separate countries, including in advance of the elections in Kenya, France, and Germany. So really quickly, I just want to end with a few changes that we've made at Facebook recently. We've made these changes to prevent bad actors from using misinformation to undermine the democratic process. This is a problem that will never be solved. We're going up against determined, well-funded adversaries, but we are making steady progress. And here are some of the important changes. This is only a small sampling of the things that we've been doing recently. Better technology. Over the last year, we've gotten increasingly better at finding and disabling fake accounts. We now block millions of fake accounts each day as they try to create them and before they've done any harm. We're also significantly investing in security. We're doubling the number of people working on safety and security from 10,000 last year to 20,000 this year. We expect these investments obviously to impact our profitability, but we think it's important to do, and that at Facebook, your safety, your people's safety needs to come before profit. And we're also collaborating within the industry. We recently joined 34 tech and security companies in signing a Tech Accord Pact to help improve security for everyone around the world. As our CEO and founder, Mark Zuckerberg, recently said in Congress last month at his testimony, that we need to take a broader view of our responsibility as a company. That means not just building products that will help people connect, but also ensuring that they are used for good and not abused. We still have a long way to go, and we will keep people appraised of our efforts as we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Aid. So we're running behind schedule. I just wanted to take a few minutes to sort of engage the panel in some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience, who I know have lots of questions. Obviously, we have a very diverse panel here, people working on very, very different kinds of projects related to rule of law and technology. So I'm going to throw out the questions that I prepared based on what I heard. Maybe for the first two speakers, so you presented some really, I thought, compelling applications of technology and how it could help. So is technology the solution? If we had unlimited amount of technology, would that solve the problem? In your case, you're having people who are reporting instances of horrible crimes and so on. So is technology the solution? It can help in reporting cases of injustice, but could it also serve as a deterrent? So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that what's really important about the work that we're doing with Medicapt is that we're not developing this app in a vacuum. We're very much focused on the low-tech interventions that we've been doing in these communities to work with colleagues to understand what is sexual violence in the first place. And it's amazing what kind of attitudes and what certain beliefs are in terms of what actually constitutes these crimes. So there's so much work to do on the low-tech end, just even in terms of getting people's skills to a place where they can actually technically do forensic exams, and to be able to share it with the police and who's that trusted person in the police station. There's so much work to do on that basic level that I would say we have been very lucky to roll out Medicapt within an environment where we already have these trusted relationships with these professionals. I would not say technology is a panacea. I would say it's one more tool in the toolbox. There's so many concerns about security and risks, and even on the low-tech side, for these people, the clinicians, the police officers who are documenting these cases, they themselves receive a lot of risk and threats to themselves, to their families for doing this work. They're documenting mass atrocities sometimes that are perpetrated by the governments or by militia groups in these communities. So I would say technology offers another angle to gathering this data. It may help to bypass some of the challenges, infrastructure hurdles in these communities. It's definitely not a panacea, and it's one more tool that these colleagues can use within their toolbox.
I would agree 100%. Our work is always starting from the ground up, and starting from the ground up means you're building trust with groups as you go in. In most cases, we will go into a community and there will be nurses or doctors there before we are. They've already established trust in that community, and the idea that there is hope for somebody to be financially included in some form of economic opportunity is first conveyed to them, who convey it to the people on the ground, so that we get a chance to get started. But really what you're doing is asking people on the ground to define what do they want for justice? What is it in their heads that they mean? And you give them some tools, and then they begin to play with the tools and show you what they need to get done. So that's how we start.
So the bootstrapping effect, yeah. Okay. Antoine, maybe a question for you. So the supply chain, having people in China report things, abuses, whatever. So is there a concern about people who are reporting this type of data, retaliation against them? And the flip side, incentivization also. How do you get people to report regularly if you really want to analyze and get some outcomes out of this? But yeah, any thoughts you have on those?
So we always undertake a risk appraisal before we start a project, and there are projects where we have turned down and said it's not even possible to get into this because the environment was just not going to go anywhere. We would put people at risk, and even if you're not thinking about jurisdictions where things are tough. Typically, if you don't have the human and institutional infrastructure to do something with the data, then the question I ask is, why do you want to collect the data in the first place, be it a grievance or a survey? If it's that, there's really no business for me, because 6 months from now, nobody's going to participate, and they're going to shoot the messenger. And so the value of technology, especially in supply chains and in a number of our businesses, is that you do that over fairly long periods of time. That's where you can get at scale, you can build the trust of the workers, etc. It's not magic wand that you just deploy on the ground and then suddenly miracles happen. So, and we are very mindful of the kind of data that we collect. We try to collect as little personal information as possible. We have a number of things to try to avoid, any revelation of who has said what. I mean, anonymity is something that is fairly, we have a number of processes and technologies to prevent that. But turning the flip side of that on the incentive side, I mean, there are small things like airtime incentives that we can provide that boost participation in the first place. But eventually, it comes back to what sort of co-design do you put in place to make sure that you're actually addressing a need and not just addressing a fad. And second is what is the capacity of these different organizations and what level of support you can have. And so it's not always easy. I mean, there are, I work in India with NGOs on the textile sector, and I would say they are fairly advanced compared to some of the NGOs now. We're starting to work in the DRC where the mandate is there, the will is there, but the capacity is lagging, and it's an endeavor for sure. Yes.
Thanks. One question for Zaid. Facebook. I'm sure other people have questions, but so basically the Facebook, a lot of the business model is really based on data mining people's posts and what their interests are, and therefore you can target things more effectively if you know a person's particular interests, likes, that's a lot of the business model of Facebook. Is there any thought of people who want to use Facebook but who still want to have their privacy and not have their data mined like that to maybe opt out or a paid service? What are Facebook's positions on that?
So I wouldn't say that our business model is data mining. I would say our business model is selling ads. And I think the way that we make sure we target the ads for the people who are the people who purchase our ads want them to be targeted to is by looking at what people or how people use the service and what kind of information they put on the service or on our platforms rather. I think that so this question of whether Facebook was looking at a paid service. My understanding is that was a question that Sheryl Sandberg was asked in the lead up to Mark testifying before Congress. And I think what she said was, that's not something we're looking at. We would have to consider it. But she didn't mean to imply that that's something that we were doing. And as far as I know, and I work at a company now with 30,000 people, so what do I know? As far as I know, like a paid service is not something that Facebook is thinking about.
So we have some time, and we're going to throw it open to the audience if you have any questions. We have 2 mics on either side of the room, so anyone who has a question, please, why don't you come up to the mic? Yeah? And please introduce yourself. Yeah?
Yeah. My name is Pablo. I work for the U.S. Department of Labor. And I have a specific question for Antoine. When you talk about this new platforms that are using technology with work organizations like unions or private companies, how do you present the idea of them benefiting from this technology? Because, most of the time you can get defensive. They can get defensive on when you're talking about these issues they're running into their supply chain. So how do you pitch the idea of using technology to improve their services to workers or their shareholders?
What do you want to do? Do you want me to answer? Right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the pitch is different to different audiences. You mentioned unions. I think historically unions have been suspicious of what we do because they see that as potentially undermining their intermediary role. My answer is always that at the moment, I would say sadly, you're dying slowly, and because you're losing membership, and so this is just a tool that potentially helps you reconnect, and increase your base. And I see that there is a younger generation of union leaders that I think are getting more and more interested in that, and we've had some of that. So I do feel that there is there is a message to these worker organizations that is quite powerful in terms of being able to reconnect to your base, have greater accountability, and having better reach and communication with your workers. When it comes to the companies, I think it's a you have two segments. Some that are highly susceptible to operational risk. So we work with extractive companies whose reputation is not necessarily very positive already. So what they care about is operational risks and human rights risks. So what is going to shut down their operations, and that's the business case for them. And then you have consumer good companies for whom it's not so much the penalties that they may get from the French law on non-financial reporting. Is obviously the reputational cost and the cost of being dragged into courts that really drives them. For the bigger ones, I think there is a small cohort of companies whose DNA is really into that have decided to differentiate themselves by being super responsible, like Patagonia and many others now coming up in the textile industry. So for them, it's a differentiation. It's something that comes from a different angle. But that's the risk is what's driving that in the first place. We're trying to make efficiency argument to them as well, because the cost of audits is, it's expensive, and it's also a waste of money most of the time if you're getting results that are not credible. But that's also a very contentious question. I mean, if you had an auditor here, I probably would have been more diplomatic about making that statement as well.
Any other questions? Yeah, please step up to the mic, yeah? Or the mic will come to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Ann Lowe from the State Department. I just had a question for, I think it would be best for Karen and Antoine, but interested in all of your feedback on it. I was curious on your projects. After, I'm assuming they're funded with donor funding, that when you go into the country, are they sustainable after the donor funding stops? So, for instance, on the app, the medical app, did the country take ownership of it, fund the people, and what's your success rate, and how do you make that transition from this is something that's incredibly cool, that's incredibly useful to you, that we'll give to you, we're funding, to now you got to run this on your own, and how do you make that transition? Is it a smooth transition, or is it abrupt, and is it successful or not? What are the best practices? Thank you.
Karen?
Yeah. Thank you for that very, very important question. We are always trying actually to convene gatherings with funders to explain to them that these are expensive initiatives and they require commitment to sustainability. So that's in terms of the startup and launching of these initiatives. And actually, one of our biggest donors that has helped us develop Medicapt, and certainly, I should say, even on the low-tech side, has helped us carry out a lot of this work, not exclusively, but has been a big support, is the State Department. But the app is designed to not be owned by Physicians for Human Rights. The data collected is not owned by Physicians for Human Rights. It's owned by the hospitals and the countries where this data is being collected. And of course, the data is gathered with the informed consent of the survivor. So there is a very rigorous process for obtaining informed consent for the survivor, especially, for sure, even in the context of doing a forensic medical exam, but with the added component of the technology and what that even de-identified data will go toward, whether it's for research or advocacy, or even to the police and justice sector. So I think you raise a phenomenally important question. At this stage, in terms of our engagement with these countries, is we work very closely with the Ministry of Health in Kenya, with the county officials where the app is being rolled out, and with the hospitals hospital administration. The same is true in DRC, where we've been rolling it out, because the idea is that we're trying to field test this not only with the end users, but with the people who care about statistics, the people who care about monitoring and tracking these cases, the government officials who are directly engaged in this process, because it will be their tool as it sort of gets launched and they own it. At this stage, we're still running the initiative because we're just field testing it. But it's absolutely the goal is that they will be running it. And what happens at that point and the risks associated with that are issues that we have to work out with them in terms of protocols and troubleshooting and security.
So I have a quick follow-up to that also. What about the private sector? And this is for any of you. Can you engage the private sector also to scale up these efforts? Anyone?
For us, from the beginning, we started the company as a company, not as an NGO, because for instance, even in the audit industry for the textile sector is worth $1 billion. And as I argued, I think you could think that shifting these resources away would not necessarily, result in a massive loss of welfare for the workers. So you have, I think, money that is being wasted and companies that are still subject to reporting, and so they are checking the box and spending that money. So we're helping them do that, and we think there's actually a very strong case there. When we work with extractive companies, 1 day of closure in a mine is $1 million. So if you can, have somehow an argument that will help you reduce that by a fraction over the next 10 years, you have a strong case as well. So there's a strong connection in our case with the supply chain and the private sector.
There is an elephant in the room in terms of virtual currency, with the number of internet coin offerings that have been out there. And each of the examples that were just given, there are a group of stakeholders, the people who created the technology and so forth, that if you put a ring fence around all the people who are involved, you could be using non-fiat or private currency, virtual currency, to be allocating it to each of the groups as they do the work. Of course, this is new, it's being tested, and it's not the Bitcoin approach. There are going to be a lot of problems with internet coins because there are so many of them, but the ones that are doing the business models out right now are looking, how do we create an economic relationship amongst a small group of people? So just take the Bangladesh camp. For it to self-organize, you need the mayor of the camp. You need people who are going to go out and do training in the camp. You're going to need people who are going to take and do outreach, all kinds of roles. Well, how do you create an economy without, there's no money, so you have to give tokens. This is not a new idea. Edgar Kahn, years ago, for domestic violence victims in this particular jurisdiction, put domestic violence victims to work, just had them mark off that they did the work, and then he went out and found funding for it separately and elsewhere. So the idea that you can incentivize people to work without literally handing them cash, but then finding ways to support it later is going to be developed in the course of this year with the virtual currency.
Any other questions from the audience? Yep.
Yeah, hello, I'm Abraham Kalon. My question goes to Jeffrey. I like your comment. All your comments about innovation development and how you talk about internet and how people with creativity can benefit from internet. I would like to know what's your interest in expanding your scope of operation towards West Africa, if you have interest. Is it only like Bangladesh or a certain part of the world, or are you intending to extend into West Africa, like Liberia? Because there are a lot of innovations in Liberia or West Africa that is growing rapidly, but there are a lot of challenges when it comes to e-commerce. A lot of people who got skills and talents, musicians, producers, directors, they don't have the means to really tap into internet expansion, to grow globally benefiting from the internet. So I would like to know whether you also think about extending your scope there as well.
It feels like a setup question. We were in Monrovia in February with a team there, and we sent a group over of musicians who then engaged with the State Department, a lot of young people on the ground who were not only establishing what roles they could play around a musician, because around a musician you have graphic artists, you've got web developers, you've got accountants, you've got managers, you have a whole team of people, and why can't you take those skills and then make them available to a company somewhere else in the world that could benefit from them and be able to earn a living. So we were there, we engaged about 60 people on the ground there, and we'll be going back as well. And the same idea that we'll be doing in Recife, Brazil, where we were a few years ago. And then if you do this radical collaboration, if you take these basic concepts and you work with a group like the World Justice Project, which is in several countries around the world all at once with hundreds of projects, you just get the ideas out into best practices and make them available to people to, on an open source basis to use. That's a little ways down the road because you have to test them and work them out first. But certainly Liberia is a place that's on our list to go back to again this year.
Any other questions from the audience? Maybe I have one more question for Zaid. So you mentioned that, you know, we all know that Facebook operates all over the world, and you mentioned a whole bunch of countries also where you have fact checkers and all of that. Given that the way that Facebook is used is so different in different countries, like in some countries, I've heard that it is the internet, right? That's what people use. Is there any adaptation that you would make in situations like that? You know, given that the nature of the use is so different in different countries.
So there's not an adaptation in the way in which we would apply our policies. But what we are looking to do and making sure that we're doing is that we're allocating the right amount of resources in different places depending on what kind of issues they may have there. So, you know, Myanmar, you know, as an example, we now have a number of teams across the company, across the world, that are now more deeply engaged on issues in Myanmar than we had before. We're also hiring a lot more people who are native speakers to work on issues there. So depending on what our needs are, then we would recalibrate and to see what, you know, what we need to do to make sure that we're addressing issues in each country, but our policies apply worldwide.
Okay, so we have time for a 1 minute and strictly 1 minute closing statement from all the panelists. You know, think of what is it that you want the audience to sort of walk away with and remember after this session. So, Jeffrey, you go first.
We're in a hyper-connected world. The rule of law operates out of the 19th century. We need to start creating new ways to make rules from the ground up and build trust in them for international standards. While that's happening, why don't we connect using social media applications such as the tools that so many people in the developing world use. I believe it's a Facebook application where translation takes place, and you connect people one with another so that I'm connected with one of the artists in Bangladesh from Myanmar that I'm working with, and she knows who I am and I know who she is, or at least we think we do, but we're getting to know each other. And you do that around the world simultaneously. That's what I think is a step in the right direction.
Thanks. Karen?
Thank you. I would say that technology has an incredible power to support people in the work that they're doing and empower them, and also it can be very disrupting in very negative ways. So where possible, to engage respectfully, with dignity, with openness and transparency with these communities, so that people in these communities have a role to play in being the protagonists in their own story as they choose to or choose not to develop technology that may work in their community.
Thanks.
I'd say that the purpose of our technology is for people to be able to exercise their rights. So it would be highly ironical if the application of that technology was in any way or form denying this potential, and the way to realize that potential is really to take a fairly humble and much more human approach to designing these tools, checking how they fail, because if our the giants are failing, small organizations like us will fail. So I think we are approaching that in deep respect for the fact that the human infrastructure is what really matters at the end, and what will give power to our small contributions.
Great. See?
I would say that technology changes very quickly. I've only been at Facebook for 9 months, but the job that I applied for, the job that I interviewed for, the job that I started on my first day, and the job that I do now are all different. Stuff happens, things change, our priorities change, our resources, we put resources where they're needed, and it's interesting to see how quickly technology can change, sometimes overnight. And then the last thing I would say is that, and I think that from what people have said, I think most people on the panel would agree, is that technology isn't good or bad. Technology is sort of agnostic. But the way people decide to use the technology is what's good or bad. Are you going to put technology to good use, or are you going to use it for nefarious reasons? And we would hope, obviously, that everyone would put it to good use.
Great. Well, the only thing I could add is I'm a technologist myself, and I've seen a lot of very complex AI machine learning technology going into recommending better movies to watch and stuff like that. I just think that this shows that there's a whole new world of applications that this advanced technology could be applied to, and it's great to see that happening here already. So it's 3 o'clock on the dot. Thank you all for coming. And did you have an announcement?
Yes, just a quick announcement. First, thanks to the panel. And as the last panel is going to get mic'd up, as it were, and hopefully successfully, I remind everybody that if you haven't had an opportunity to please fill out your evaluations. You can deposit it right outside this venue, but it will give you an opportunity. And again, thank you for all for your attendance and your insightful comments.